baby steps. It's a phrase we can use to describe those small, simple steps to progress, to go forward. Maybe we think of a day, we think of that morning, and maybe that morning you feel like, I am tired. It feels like everything has been going the wrong way. We can think, what are those baby steps so that today isn't a day of regressing, but maybe today is a day where even if it's just a little step, I'm making just a little bit of headway on what yesterday was. You can't run a marathon all at once. It's step by step by step. You can't climb a mountain all at one time. It's step after step after step. They only have that idea and that word, that phrase, baby steps. It's been in our vocabulary a long time, but really, it's from a movie back in 1991 that phrase, which wasn't uncommon before. If you've had kids or been around babies, you know those first steps are hard, but those little baby steps add up over time. But that movie in 1991 was where that phrase, baby steps, entered kind of our pop vernacular, our everyday vocabulary. And it was a movie, too, that I don't know if it was the first, but it was one of the first movies in Hollywood where someone with mental illness was portrayed not as this monstrous villain, but as someone worth value, someone even maybe endearing, someone that was worthy of being loved. Well, that movie is What About Bob? I don't know if you've ever seen the movie. It was a 1991 comedy with Richard Dreyfuss and Bill Murray. And in that movie, you had Richard Dreyfuss's character, you had Leo Marvin. It's his story, the story of Leo Marvin, an arrogant, self-obsessed, self-absorbed therapist with a groundbreaking self-help book. And they had a patient, this neurotic patient with a goldfish, a litany of fears, and a serious set of boundary issues. It's Bob Wiley, played by Bill Murray. In the book, the title of that book was Baby Steps. And the start, that first encounter toward the start of the movie, you have Leo meeting up with Bob, and Bob becomes enamored and even obsessed with this idea of baby steps. It dawns on him in a very literal way as he's leaving the office. He's like, baby steps to leave the office. He's like, baby steps down the hall. He's like, baby steps can get me anywhere. And in the next scene you have him, it's in him in New York City, and he's just taking these little baby steps, thinking of baby steps to get anywhere. And he becomes obsessed with this idea of how to use baby steps toward that end of progress, even if he was taking it a little too literal, those small steps to becoming a better person. Well, and then Bob he becomes a little too obsessed with Leo. And he wants to go to Leo for help, but Leo went on vacation. So Bob becomes an intrusion on Leo and his family, even joining them for their New Hampshire vacation away. I told you he had serious boundary issues. So he inserts themselves in this man's life. And the rest of the family, as the story goes, they grow to love Bob. But while they grow to love Bob more, this genuine, albeit somewhat broken character, Leo grows to resent him more and more and more because this man is wrecking everything he had worked so hard to build up, this perfect life that Leo had set up for himself, and Bob is this annoying guy ruining it all, ruining that space away. And slowly over the course of the movie, Leo's perfect life erodes away until he's lost it all. He loses his peaceful vacation. He even loses his vacation home. And it goes on, he loses his budding fame. He loses any celebrity he had from a rough interview that he had, I think, with Good Morning America It didn't go well for him. He does his best to lose the respect of his family through the course of the film too. And then up until the last moments of it, he's even lost his sanity. Yeah, the movie's portrayed as this comedy. And it is. And there are plenty of funny moments through the movie, and in the end, there is resolution that's positive, which is typically a general comedy formula that the movie ends, the story ends with resolution. Things end on an upbeat. And so it does have that, but if you look at the movie from the perspective of Leo Marvin, it's not a comedy at all. This is a tragedy. This is a tragedy, and it has a horrific conclusion to it. And with this major assist to Bob, Leo has been the author of his own demise. His self-importance and his lack of patience and lack of love, what's left him a broken man. And so we get to the end of the story, the last of our judges today. There's 12 judges in the book of Judges, and we're getting to the second half of that 12 judges story. And in that we have another man who due to his selfishness, due to his lack of restraint, his disregard for God, well, he, like Leo Marvin, he lost it all. We're wrapping up Samson's story today. Maybe you know that end of Samson's story. He was a man who he wasn't taking baby steps, but he was taking leaps and bounds away from God and what God's will was for his life. You know, he was doing that his whole life he played out that role of being a judge, but every decision he made wasn't a decision into what God wanted. God would work it into his plan. But Samson's choices were taking him away from who God had called him to be. And it's only in the last moments of his life that we see Samson humble and contrite. And he's truly prayerful, truly reliant on God's intervention. If you have a Bible with you, whether it's paper, whether it's digital, whether it's whatever, I invite you to open it up to Judges chapter 16 this morning. And from the start of this chapter to the end of his life, Samson he's over with the enemies. And in fact, most of what we read about Samson at all, his story, he's over with the Philistines. He's hanging out with the bad guys. He's hanging out with this people who are the oppressors of the Israelites, the oppressors of Samson's people. And so he's down there again in chapter 16. All three of the women that Samson chases after, well, they're Philistine women too. He's chasing after them. And the clear impression given, because at the start of 16, he's down in the Philistine capital. And the impression given is that he is not a welcome guest there. They do not want him there at all. But he is there anyway. You know, he has superhuman strength. He's also a bit of a loose cannon. So they don't want to stir it up. What can they do about this guy? And so they scheme, and so they work out plans to try and figure out how to get him to tell them the secret of his strength, how to disarm this volatile weapon of a man so that then they can rid themselves of him. And so last week we saw this encounter between him and his new bride, his new wife at the time, where he's playing coy. He has this riddle he's given people, and she's trying to get the meaning of that. She's trying to save her life and the rest of her family's lives. And he's playing coy with what the meaning of that riddle is until she pleaded and persisted enough that he finally caved and told her. So today we come across really a similar encounter, now with his new fling, Delilah. And she wants to know the secret of his strength. She's not trying to save her family. She's not in danger. She wants to get some money. She wants to get some silver for doing this. And plus, I think she wants the esteem, the accolades, and the prestige that will come from her people of being the one that can save them from Samson, being the one that got the secret of his strength. And so three times, Samson feeds her a line. She tries to discover that secret. And three times she's left feeling embarrassed in front of all her people. She's making her look like a fool. But still she persists. And this morning, where we pick things up in chapter 16, we're in verse 15, it's stepping into that fourth time, her trying to get that secret of his strength. Then she said to him, "How can you say, 'I love you,' when you won't confide in me? This is the third time you have made a fool of me and haven't told me the secret of your great strength." With such nagging, she prodded him day after day until he was sick to death of it. So he told her everything. "No razor has ever been used on my head," he said, "because I have been a Nazirite dedicated to God from my mother's womb. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me, and I would become as weak as any other man." When Delilah saw that he had told her everything, she sent word to the rulers of the Philistines, Come back once more. He has told me everything." So the rulers of the Philistines returned with the silver in their hands. After putting him to sleep on her lap, she called for someone to shave off the 7 braids of his hair, and so began to subdue him, and his strength left him. Then she called, and she had done this the other times too, she called, "Samson, the Philistines are upon you." He awoke from his sleep and thought, "I'll go out as before and shake myself free." But he did not know that the Lord had left him. Then the Philistines seized him, gouged out his eyes, and took him down to Gaza. Binding him with bronze shackles, they set him to grinding grain in the prison. But the hair on his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. And what we see in Samson is that he put so much trust in his own strength, or this strength that he has. He put so much trust in the sign of that strength too. I believe that he, somewhere deep down, he truly knows that it's not the hair that's giving him strength. But I also think he loses sight of that too. From what he shares with Delilah, he's lost sight of that. And I think what we see as the reader when we look at this overall story of Samson is that the sign and the status, they don't equal the source. They're not the source. And he can often, I think that it is. And I don't know, as I was thinking through this, there was an everyday picture that came to mind. And it was a hose with a sprayer on it. Like you got to turn that on, and you get this hose, and then you just spray it, and water's supposed to come out, right? Of course water's supposed to come out. It's a hose. If you got a sprayer on the end, that's what it's for. But if you just think that a hose with a sprayer on the end is going to equal water coming out, well, you already know you're missing a big part of the equation. Well, you got to turn the spigot on, or even more than turning the spigot on, it's got to be connected to a spigot at all. And if it's not connected to a spigot at all, if it's not connected to the source, no water's going to ever come out of here. It's just a prop for a pretty pointless purpose. There's no water. There's no source to this that is going to make it functional. And I feel like that's a lot like what Samson is and what Samson does as he trusts in the sign of his strength. But that hair, it wasn't the source of his strength. God was the source of his strength. That hair, as a sign, it does what signs do. What do signs do? Signs point to something else. A sign makes known something else that's true. A sign, it's an identifying marker. It's conveying information about what's coming up or what's going on. And by itself, a sign, well, it's just a thing. It's just a thing. If that thing lacks any substance, well, then it's just an empty promise. It's just hollow words. His hair was just a sign. Otherwise, we could all grow long hair, and we'd all get superhuman strength from it. I'm pretty sure that's not how it works either. So when that thing was gone, we'll get into that later of what he loses, because Samson becomes a guy, though, that he thinks that just because he sees a sprayer on the end of a garden hose, well, it's going to spray water out whenever he wants it to, right? He thinks that's the most important thing, and losing sight of the most important thing. Well, it does them in, because the most important thing is the source of that strength, the source of all of that. And also, really related to that, in Samson's life, we see that it's his disregard and disobedience that led to his defeat. He had complete disregard for what God wanted from him. And the impression that we're given as we see these interactions with Delilah is that he was far more concerned about Delilah's affection than with God's approval and God's authority. And there's a word used to describe Samson that we've come across the past couple of weeks. We just read it just a second ago when we went through the scripture. It's that he was born a Nazarite. And for us, there's no real reference point for what that means, that he's a Nazarite, other than what we can kind of gain as clues from what we read in Judges. That, okay, it means something as far as what God has designated him as. As a Nazarite, what that means is that it means he's a separated one. He's a set apart one consecrated. And there's three main examples in the Bible of Nazarites. First is Samson. Then second is actually the last of the judges. It's Samuel. Samson's the last judge in the book of Judges. Samuel, you get to the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, he's the last of the overall judges of Israel. He fits that model of being a Nazarite too. And then the third, and it never says that he is a Nazarite, but you look at his life and you look at the details surrounding all that, he really fits the model. It's John the Baptist. He fits this model of being a Nazarite. And interesting enough, because all three didn't choose to be Nazarites. They were Nazarites from birth. And all three of them were born to parents who couldn't have kids until God intervened, until God made a way. And so in Numbers chapter 6, it spells out how someone can make a vow, because you could make a vow to become a Nazarite. And there's other clues. We see other places that people did that. But there's three main stipulations, whether you're a Nazarite by birth or you're one that wants to step into that commitment of becoming a Nazarite. There's three main stipulations to that vow. And the three parts are, no alcohol or wine of any kind. You couldn't even have grapes or raisins. All that was off limits. Nothing of the vine. So nothing of the vine. 2, it's you don't go near a dead body. You don't do that if you're a Nazarite. And then 3, you don't cut your hair. You let it grow. And long hair is that visual symbol of the vow that was made. And so, even though he was a Nazarite from birth, Samson still would have been held to these 3 stipulations of the vow. And we read that Samson, he lost his strength when his hair was cut. That's true. That's when he lost his strength. But I don't believe his strength was lost only because he cut his hair. His hair was the sign that he was consecrated. Really, it was the last point of obedience, the last point of holiness in his life. It was the only thing left symbolizing that he was set apart by God was that long hair. But I think the fuller reason of why he lost his strength, the fuller reason why God left him, was because of that disregard, that disobedience to the source of his strength. The passage we read last week, you go to chapter 14 in Judges. Pretty quickly on, he breaks 2 of those 3 stipulations. Because the one part, and you might remember this, it's a really weird part where he eats honey out of a lion's carcass. Well, one, we talked about last week, that makes him unclean. It would. But man, that's number 1 right there on the vows. Okay, 1 down, or 1 on the stipulations. So he's already crossed 1 off the list. Right after that encounter, then he goes to where the Philistines are, and they're throwing a party. It says he throws a feast. That's kind of that week of his wedding. He's throwing this big feast with these guys over there, and the Hebrew word is mishta. And while we typically translate it as feast in any of our English translations, it's not a feast like a Thanksgiving meal is a feast. A mishta, it was a drinking party. A really big emphasis on the drinking there. It's just drinking party often with lots of wine, lots of other alcohol that would be consumed. And so Samson and the boys, Well, they partied it up for 7 days. Well, that's another one that is off the list that he ticks off as far as breaking the stipulations of the vow. 12 verses into his life, 2 of the 3 are already out the window. Now he's only hanging on by that long hair. That's all he's got left. Samson, this child of the promise, this God's gift to his people, he's blowing it really before he even gets started with his life. Like Leo Marvin and What About Bob? Well, you see the road Samson's going down. And you wish you could do something to stop. Maybe you've watched a show and you felt that, like, oh, I want to do that. I want to go in there. And you would want to make a decision because you know what's going to happen if you go down this road. But we're left just reading the pages of his life, of Samson's life, watching how this all unfolds, knowing it's not going to lead anywhere good. And it doesn't lead anywhere good for him, because once that hair's cut, well, game over. That's it. And so now we get to the end of his life. He's lost everything. No wife, no friends, no family in sight. The woman he was chasing after, she's dumped him. Got her money and ran. He's got no strength, no authority, no power of any kind. He can't lead his people from here like this. He doesn't even have any eyesight. He's left shamed and humiliated. This rescuer of Israel that's now a trophy of the Philistines. He's this caged and mutilated man kept alive to entertain his adversaries. It's a brutal existence. So when we pick it up in verse 23 again, you have the Philistines, they're throwing a big party. They're celebrating that their god Dagon, that he had brought them victory over their enemy. So we jump back into Judges 16. Now the rulers of the Philistines assembled to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to celebrate, saying, "Our God has delivered Samson, our enemy, into our hands." When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, "Our God has delivered our enemy into our hands, the one who laid waste our land and multiplied our slain." While they were in high spirits, they shouted, "Bring out Samson to entertain us." So they called Samson out of the prison, and he performed for them. When they stood him among the pillars, Samson said to the servant who held his hand, "Put me where I can feel the pillars that support the temple, so that I may lean against them." Now the temple was crowded with men and women. All the rulers of the Philistines were there, and on the roof were about 3,000 men and women watching Samson perform. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me. Please, God, strengthen me just once more, and let me with one blow get revenge on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." Then Samson reached toward the 2 central pillars on which the temple stood. Bracing himself against them, his right hand on the one and his left hand on the other, Samson said, "Let me die with the Philistines." Then he pushed with all his might, and down came the temple on the rulers and all the people in it. Thus he killed many more when he died than while he lived. Then his brothers and his father's whole family went down to get him. They brought him back and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father. He had led Israel 20 years. It's a sad ending. We see that moment of incredible power, but it's a sad ending. And I'll just say as a side note here, I know, and we've talked about this before, when the book of Judges, where there are those there's a lot of violence, gruesomeness through these stories as well. There's a very common thread through the book of Judges that these judges aren't just rescuers of Israel's, but they're the means by which God is bringing a long-deserved judgment on these people that live, not you say such a barbaric way, but that would They sacrificed their children to worship these gods. They were gruesome and brutal to anyone and everyone. They were long under God's judgment. I'm not going to go into all the details about that here, but I know as we read through this, this is that dissonance, part of that dissonance through the book of Judges. And if that's something that you wrestle with, I get it. I'd love to talk with you and at least share how I have seen that, how you have a God that can be loving and good, but also just. And you see the pictures of it. It looks like loveless justice showing up on the pages of the book of Judges, but how that can be the same God we see in Jesus. It is the same God we see in Jesus. And if you struggle with that, that's a very human thing. But I'd love to have that conversation with you. We have this picture at the end of his life, and it's a tragic end to his story. And I know I'm left wondering, did it have to be like this? I mean, God, we saw that last week, how God worked his purposes to fruition in spite of Samson many times. God still had his plans and worked it to work out how he wanted it to, regardless of if Samson paid any attention or gave any regard to what God wanted. But there's that question, did it have to end like this for Samson? I think we wrestle with that when we see that, because it is a sad ending, but right in the thick of that sad ending, and really a funeral at the end of that, what we see is that Samson finally submits to God. He finally gets that it's not about him. It's about God. And in that moment, we see that there's strength in surrender. There's strength when we submit to God, strength when we rely on him. It's not our strength, but it's God's strength showing up in our lives as we trust him fully with that. He lived his life. Samson lived his life taking massive strides in the opposite direction from who God had called and made him to be. Massive strides right into the arms of the enemy. And it cost him everything. Finally, at the end of his life, he comes to the point of realizing, well, it's not about Samson. It's about God. He's finally not trusting in the sign anymore. He's placing that trust fully in God and what God can do. And he's seeking the source with all he has left. So an act of faith, an act of self-sacrifice like that, well, that's rare. And while Samson's actions, as him being the one bringing God's judgment on the Philistine, those are very unique circumstances. He was a very particular man, set apart for a very particular past, for a very particular reason, at a very particular time. But what rings true for us still is that step in surrendering to God. In that step in surrendering to God, he is trusting in what God can do, what God alone can do. And that's something that we can do too. And that's something really we need to do too, is to not trust in what I can do. Yeah, we have something we can do, ways to contribute, but trust in what God can do and the strength that God has. And so we end on a question. Not a question about big steps or baby steps, but what's your next step? What's that next step in following God? There were so many places where Samson's next step could have set him on a course for life instead of death, where I think it could have changed everything. And ultimately, he did place his trust in God. And God did what God does, and God showed up. That's what he did, but what about you? You might be here this morning, and you might feel like you've taken 10,000 steps in the wrong direction. You've taken 10,000 steps away from what you need to do, what you feel like you should do, what you know God would want you to do, and you feel like you've been running from that. And just disregarding God and walking this way. Maybe you feel like that today, where if you looked back, you don't want to look back, but if you looked back, you couldn't even see on the horizon where that one place is anymore. It feels too far gone. It feels like a lost cause. Maybe you feel like Samson, that everything is lost, that you become the author of your own demise, and that all that's left to do is to be miserable and die. And that's it. That you can continue down that road, absolutely. But you don't have to continue down that road. You don't have to get to the point of the very end of your life and then make that turn. There's a moment to, Samson shows us that, but you don't have to wait till it gets that far down the road to make that turn. Because that way leads nowhere good. Leads nowhere life-giving. Take that step toward God, the God who redeems and restores. Take that step to the God who, he says in Joel 2:25 that he restores the years the locusts have eaten. And that promise, it was given to the Israelites back when everything looked lost. And the picture of the locusts is that picture of this massive swarm of bugs that is all-consuming. Or if you're a farmer and that's what you rely on for your own food, for any money that you have, you're fully reliant on crops for your sustenance. And so is everyone around you. The locusts devastate the land. The swarm of bugs that comes through and eats everything bare. So there's nothing left. All that's left in their wake is destruction and lifelessness. It's devastating. But God is the one that can restore those years. Those locusts in your life have eaten away. He can bring new life there. He not only can do that, he does do that too. And if you feel like you're in that spot where it's all the way back there, where you feel like that's where I walked away. That's where those 10,000 steps in the wrong direction started. You don't want to look back because it looks ugly. You're going to be reminded of how you got down this road. And you feel stuck. And we think if we look back, what we're going to see is God, those 10,000 steps away. It's, all right, start making your way back here. But that's not what happens. And I know that because I know that from my own life too. That when you're in that spot, when you turn, it's not God over there. You're met with Jesus right here. He meets you right where you're at. He says, let's go live. Let's live a life that's not just worth living, but a life that's full and abundant. A life with freedom. That's what he calls you and that's what he invites you into. I know what he's done for me, and I know how he set me free. You don't have to be stuck in that spot any longer. Turn to him and live. And church, let's live following him every single step of the way. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for how good and how faithful and how true you are. And Lord, I pray that we would be trusting you with every single step. Would you make it abundantly clear what that next step is? Lord, you are the one who is always faithful. You are the one who forgives, who's faithful to forgive. You're the one worth trusting, the one worth following. Thank you, Jesus, that in you we have hope of new life, that everything has changed because of what you have done. Would we trust in not just what you have done, but what you continue to do and what you promise to do? Would we trust you to be our strength, to be our vision, to be our guide? Would we trust you every single step along the way? In your name we pray. Amen.